Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about political parties and their decline and why they are important in our system. So we're going to define political parties and we're going to make sure that you understand why they are important. Last time we talked in terms of how people perceive reality and also how we have opinions formed in the languages that we use. George Orwell and Walter Lippmann primarily were the essays that we talked about. And then, if you remember last time, I assigned the Making of the President videos of 1960 with John F. Kennedy and 1968. One of the objectives in assigning those videos was that I wanted you to see how the country had changed from 1960, when we had 4 primaries, to 1968, where we had over 28 primaries. Who runs the primaries and what are the primaries primarily for? They are to have candidates that are endorsed by a party on the ballot. So let's start with this idea of a definition of what is a political party. Political parties are defined in our class and also are defined in a technical sense as activists who are organized to win elections. You win elections in order to operate the government, meaning jobs, and determine public policy. So again, let me repeat that. Activists who are organized to win elections, to operate the government, and to determine public policy. That is our definition of a political party. So how many political parties do we have in this country? According to our definition, we have 2. We have the Democrats and the Republicans. Now you may be asking, well, when I look at our ballot, we have the Green Party, we have the Natural Law Party, we have the Libertarian Party, we have parties, maybe 12 or 15 on the ballot. Yes, but they don't win elections. So therefore, they really aren't political parties. They may be social organizations, they may be platforms for issues and ideas, but because they don't win elections, it's very, very difficult to call them political parties. So they're not. So again, look at and compare our definition to what we talked about last time with the pseudo environment and how people perceive political parties and how ideologues, right? Ideologues, especially true believers of political parties, how they view politics and how they view political parties. So it would be almost the reverse, right? People get involved in politics and people get involved in political parties to operate the government. Maybe there's a job, appointed job that you'd like, or maybe that you have a career interest in government and politics. But also in the mainstream person, the average person, votes because they either, right, there is an issue of public policy that they're concerned about, or personality of the candidate. And as you saw in the film Making of the President 1960, this idea of personality comes to the forefront from that time on. So it's completely the opposite, right? It's completely opposite of why you have an activist joining and being in a party and why a individual supports a party. So with that introduction, we start with Harold Gosner's essay number 32 on the urban political machine. Now, we have our definition of a party, and let's look at what is a machine. When they mean political machine, what does Gosnell and other political analysts talk about? Well, before civil service reform, you had the spoils system, and many of you have heard of this from Andrew Jackson and your social studies in high school or before. And the spoils system basically says that winner takes all. So if you're the president and you win, then you can appoint all of your people in the government. And a very early iteration of this was, of course, Marbury versus Madison. So what is the boss, or what does the machine do? So again, before government was involved, especially the federal government was involved in programs on the social net, you had ward bosses or ward captains. And you can call them precinct captains, or you can call them whatever they want. But basically the ward captain was a person whose job was to get voters to support the party. Not the candidate, the party. Okay? Now, let's say many of you, I know, are wanting to be police officers or firemen or government social workers or something to be employed by the government. Local governments mostly, or county governments, right? And under the civil service system, you get certification, you go take some classes, and you take an exam. It's called merit-based. So you have merit-based hiring. Well, if you wanted to, or let's say you had an aunt or an uncle who wanted to be a fireman, who was a policeman, how did they get that job? They got that job because they had a relationship with the ward captain, right? And he was the one who said, hey, I hear you want to be a policeman. Make sure that our candidate wins and you become a policeman. So you have the ward captain, the party, and basically either the individual who receives petty gifts or programs or jobs, right? And this is the relationship that we have. This is what so if I'm, and the last great party boss was Mayor Daley of Chicago. You may have remembered seeing him with the Kennedys in 1960. He was a very, very famous political mayor of Chicago. You may have also saw him in 1968 flipping off the speaker, talking about the tactics of the Chicago police during the convention of that summer. That's Mayor Daley. So people understood it. People start identifying with the political party. And they also understand that if they don't vote, someone else will take their job. So again, going back to my example, if you had an aunt or uncle who was a policeman or a fireman or a brother or somebody in your family, they would make sure you voted, right? They would make sure that you, on election day, they would take you by the hand and make sure that you voted. And that's how basically the machine worked. Now, in Gosnell's essay, he talks about immigration, and he talks about the rural to the urban migration that happened before the 1930s, and also immigration of people from other countries. And he said that if you remember the conclusion, and we'll get to this later, but he basically said if you would take away this labor pool of the machines, then you wouldn't have political machines. That conclusion is at best unsubstantiated. My immigrants and people who migrate from different countries tend to have different political points of view. For example, people use this term Latino or Latina or Hispanic, and that is a term that is basically artificial. If I look at the politics of Cuban Americans, or if I look at the politics of, just to take a group of Puerto Rican Americans and their political values and their political, how they tend to vote, their voting behavior, Cubans are very conservative and Puerto Ricans tend to be more liberal. So again, when you make these broad generalities, and the media does this all the time, they can be true, but mostly they are not. The data says a different thing than what actually people believe when it comes to these kind of things, when it comes to voting behavior. And voting behavior in political science is a pretty well-developed methodology of determining where people are. Okay. So again, for context, Gosnell's talking about Chicago, and he's talking about Chicago in the 1930s. Now again, what do we know about Chicago in the 1930s? Well, we know Al Capone, right? We know that there was, because of Prohibition, you had Chicago, and you had this mix between criminal, public, right? So the criminals would bribe the aldermen or bribe the judges. We've all seen movies and things like that, right? And public and private. And so Gosnell is trying to sort of wade through the morass of corruption in government, but also the public perception at that time of the, let's just say, the acceptance of corruption in both in the institutions. So again, as a reminder, I'd like you to pay attention to the authors and why they put this certain essay in the book. And on page 168, again, essay 32, Urban Political Machines, the authors say, Gosnell captures the advantages and disadvantages of the old-style machine politics in his classic description of Chicago politics in the 1930s. Many of the functions performed by governmental agencies since the days of the New Deal were handled quite efficiently by the old political machines. In the heyday of urban political machines, in the first half of the 20th century, a single political boss, sometimes not even holding an elective office, dominated the formal processes of government by controlling jobs and building personal loyalty by doing favors for voters and business leaders alike. Okay, so that is the relationship that I was describing. Now, Harry S. Truman, was a member of a political machine in Missouri called the Pendergast machine. Now, Truman wasn't personally corrupt, but he was a member of the machine, and he did benefit from the votes that those machines produced. And when he was first elected to the Senate, Harry Truman was basically ostracized by senators and President Roosevelt because of the way he got elected. People called him the senator from Pendergast. So these machines, some were Democratic, some were Republican. By the 1930s, most of the Republican machines had already sort of faded in the woodwork, but they were very, very important. So again, let's talk about Chicago in the 1930s. Gosnell starts, what is the balance sheet of the machine politics in the urban center, such as Chicago during the period of economic crisis? So again, his first line gives the impression of a objective analysis of the question. Now, of course, as you read the article, you know that Gosnell has a definite point of view. He does not like machine politics and believes that the New Deal and the programs that have been established by President Roosevelt would help weaken the machine and become a much better political environment. But again, he starts on the credit side of the ledger should replace the success of bosses in softening class conflict by granting petty favors to various nationalistic and local groups, by taking advantage of the subsidies offered by the national government, by keeping the attention of the voters distracted by factional quarrels and sham disputes, and the party machines have kept minor party movements from gaining any headway. Well, it's very interesting, right? It's a very interesting point, because in our definition of political parties, right, activists who are organized to win elections, Gosnell says the political machine was the vehicle that was made, or that was intended to squash these minority parties. So if you look at Great Britain has a whole slew of parties, or Germany. They have Greens, and they have Conservatives and Liberals, and blah, blah, all these different parties. We have two, right? We have two parties. And so Gosnell is saying the machine did two things that he credits them with. Number one, class conflict. Now again, we go back to Gitlow, and right, why wasn't there an anarchist or Bolshevik revolution in this country? Why wasn't there? Well, one of the reasons people say is that there was an outlet. First of all, starting with Teddy Roosevelt and going to Franklin Roosevelt, there was a outlet that people had, voting, and these petty favors and these ideas of loyalty also did not give people the whole sense that the whole system was corrupt, or that the whole system was distant, that they had a chance, right? This idea of social mobility in this country, of having the tenets of a meritocracy, as we talked about with the Constitution. So the machine, Gosnell says, prevented class conflict, but it also prevented the establishment of third parties, right? So you could never, what would happen is a third party or third group, like Perot in 1993, the Reform Party, quote unquote, they would have an idea, and that idea would be popular. In Perot's case, it was budget reduction. And so what would happen is they might run one election, or they might run another election, but they never got anybody elected. And then the regular two parties would take over that popular idea. So again, this week you're going to see the Making of the President 1964. And why that's an important video is because before 1964, where you had the ideological makeup of the two parties before 1964 was the Democrats had conservative, mostly Southerners, and liberal, Northeastern and Westerners. And the Republicans, forgive my back, the Republicans had conservatives who were from the West, mostly, and you had liberals. You had liberal Republicans up until 1964 that were basically from the East and the upper Midwest. Now, I'm using the term liberal and conservative because a liberal and conservative are, again, scientifically and technically the correct term. because liberals say our system is legitimate. Liberals believe in the Constitution. Conservatives say our system is legitimate. They believe in the Constitution. Now, progressives, right? Progressives, people who call themselves progressives today, and I would guess you'd call them ultra-right or fascists, right? These people do not believe in our Constitution. They want to change the system. So this is a very, very important point that you must understand. And one of the most liberal, he was a historian with John F. Kennedy, very famous historian, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. wrote a book called The Disunifying of the United States in the 1990s. And he makes this point, I think, very, very well between what is a liberal and what is a progressive, or what is a, he uses a different term, but he means the same thing. All right, so Gosnell says that if we take a balance sheet, we have this kind of action on the plus side. And after 1964, so after 1964, the Republicans become the conservative party of this country, and the Democrats become the liberal party of this country. Now today, of course, this is shifting. The liberals now are becoming, in the Democratic Party, progressive. The conservatives, determining who you ask or how you define it, the conservatives, the establishment conservatives, are sort of partyless, right? Because Trump won, and Trump is not necessarily a conservative. People like George Will and the people at the National Review, they don't support Trump. So they're sort of out of the ideological Republican Party right now, and you have more of a populist, if you want to call it that. And populist could, as I said, populism could be thought of as the people who support those ideas support the Constitution, but they're on an economically different scale than conservatives. Populists are not free traders. Conservatives tend to be free traders. Conservatives don't necessarily have a point of view on manufacturing. Populists tend to think that manufacturing is a cure-all for our economy. So again, there's a different idea between these labels, but populism, one could say, do they agree with our system? I would say that they say they do, but much less so than, let's say, a conservative. But they're not fascists, or they're not members of the alt-right. So again, these things are fluid, and people and their perceptions change through these things. But 64 was a very, very important time because Barry Goldwater came out, and Republicans had a tradition of civil rights, and basically the politicians, Richard Nixon and Barry Goldwater, primarily stopped courting the African American vote. And Goldwater came out in '64 claiming that his argument was that it was a government intrusion, and so he voted against the '64 Voting Rights Act, which again has tainted the Republican Party, I would say, especially Republicans who think that the African American vote could be important. Because the bottom line is history does give perceptions, and even though the Republican Party is not, I don't believe it is a racist party, but the Republican Party has a record of this duality of in the 1860s, being formed for abolition and being the party of the Union throughout the Civil War and throughout the quote-unquote progressive era. And then in 1964, this all changes, and the Republican Party really becomes the party of conservatives. And again, I'm not equating racism with conservatism at all. What I'm trying to say is that vote and Goldwater's position on that vote guaranteed Republican presidential domination from 68 to 2008, but it also really hampered their argument when it comes to particularly the African American community. All right. So again, giving you some context of what Gosnell's talking about and why machines may be given credit for not having so much class conflict as Germany had in the 30s or the 20s before Hitler came to power, and Italy and other Western European countries, Great Britain, etc., experienced from the 1920s and the 1930s. So then he goes on, right? Some of the submerged groups may not be so appreciative, but the fact remains that during the years 1930 and 1936, Chicago was comparatively free from violent labor disputes, hunger riots, and class warfare. The decentralized, chaotic, and inadequate character of the governmental organizations of the city has discouraged far-reaching demands upon local authorities. During the Depression, the machine also acted as a kind of buffer for the various governmental agencies which have had to deal with the distress. So again, you would go, if you, let me again give you some context of the 1930s. The 1930s had 25% unemployment. There was no welfare, there was no unemployment insurance, there was very, very little governmental programs in order to help people that found themselves on tough times. So what would you do? You would go to your ward boss, right? And you would say, Mr. Ward Captain, usually, my husband or I need a job. There are no jobs to be had. Can you help me? So this acted as a buffer to protesting or to engaging the government head on. And he goes on, the relief activities of the party workers were not systematic and, of course, were not disinterested, but they were devoid of red tape. So again, let's say it's tough times and you're a mother of several little children and your husband's a drunk. Today what would happen, right? Or your husband's using drugs and he's in the household and the social worker comes today and asks you for a drug test, and you could really lose your benefits. And who suffers? Well, the kids. This is at least the argument. So again, what happens is you go to the ward boss, you went to high school with the person, you have a long relationship with the person, they know your family, they know that your husband is a drunk or uses drugs, and so they look the other way. Right? They help you out and there's no embarrassment, there's no what they call red tape. Okay. So that's for the individual during the Depression. What else was an advantage of the machine? Well, Gosnell goes on to say in page 169 that what was great about the machine was the rules didn't change. Right? The rules didn't change. So if I'm a business leader and I know I have to bribe the local city street commissioner to get a parking inspection or to get a loading zone, right? That is what I have to do, and the rules aren't changing. They don't now all of a sudden make me bribe the two other people down the road. Ward leaders, he says, ward leaders in particular showed an amazing low turnover considering the stresses and strains that accompanied the economic crisis. Businessmen, journalists, underworld leaders, bankers, labor chiefs knew that they could count upon the local machine to do business in the old way in spite of changes that have taken place in the role of the national government. Right? So Roosevelt is elected in 1932. He takes office in March of 1933. The banks have closed, and he starts the National Recovery Act, And he starts to get all of these things starting to go on the federal level, which is revolutionary and brand new, but it doesn't go down to the local level. As he says, inefficiency in local government could be tolerated if it meant resistance to the extension of local public services, and the largest industrialists, newspaper proprietors, bankers, and gambling kings did not want a state income tax, a modern tax collection system, or an expansion of municipal services and budgets. Party bosses were a bulwark against such changes. All right, so again, what's going on? What do we see? We see this idea of modernization. You see this idea of automation coming through, and guess what happens? When you have a tax system, when you have a state tax system, and it's automated, and you have a paper trail, it's pretty hard to be Al Capone. Matter of fact, that's how they got Al Capone, right? They didn't get Al Capone on any of his alcohol. They didn't get him on any of the murders. What did they get him on? Tax evasion. How do you do that? Well, it's quite simple. It was estimated that Mr. Capone was earning about $1 million a month. And he put on his taxes that he was a furniture distributor. And so the IRS started to ask him questions such as, well, if you're a furniture distributor, how can you afford this huge suite in the Plaza, in the largest luxury hotel in Chicago? And how can you afford these cars? And how can you afford all these other things? And pretty soon, before you know it, he's convicted because you can't explain it. And the party bosses are in the same situation, right? If you're the party boss and you're controlling street budgets, sewer budgets, infrastructure budgets of all types, jobs of all types, and you don't hold election, you don't have an elective office, and if you have a tax system, you have to pay taxes too. That's the advantage of rule of law. Everyone pays. And so, again, they were very, very against these types of reforms because it would put everybody on record. He goes on, those citizens who might have benefited from such modifications of the role of local government were indifferent, deficient in promotional skills, misled by the press, and disillusioned by the failure of reform waves to leave many permanent traces. Well, I don't know about that. In a very famous election between a reform candidate and Mayor Daley in Chicago, and this was in the late 60s, early 70s, a reporter asked a woman, why are you voting for Mayor Daley? Mayor Daley's sister got this big appointment as a big job with the Chicago schools. And don't you think that's, and she's not even a teacher, don't you think that's a real disadvantage? And don't you think that corruption is really hurting the city? And the woman responded, well, if you don't like someone helping their family out, how can I support someone who won't help their family? Right? So the woman took the point that Daley was helping his sister was not a corrupt act. It was an act of a loving brother and family connections. Because she expected the same thing. She expected that when it was her family and they had a connection, that they would benefit from that. And that's what, again, Gosnell's trying to say, that the people who would have benefited from a more automated and more modern public administration system failed to realize that, right? Their pseudo environment didn't interpret reality in that way. So again, these were what he calls the positives, the credits on the balance sheet. But the Depression, according to him, the Depression also created a challenge for resources, and that both parties could no longer afford, a city could no longer afford two machines, and so basically what happened was one machine survived, primarily Democratic, but one machine survived and the other party's machine died. Again, he goes on 169, a city can support more than one political machine when real estate values are rising and incomes are going up. During such times, the taxpayers are not so tax conscious as in lean times, and the general public is more indifferent to graft exposures and wasteful expenditures of public funds. In a period of economic depression, there is graft enough for only one machine. The law of the pendulum in democratic countries operates against the party which is in power when the economic deprivations are first being felt. This happened with the Republicans because Herbert Hoover was in office. Pardon me. Herbert Hoover was in office, and of course the shanty towns that were developed were called Hoovervilles. And the Democrats then controlled the Congress almost uninterrupted from 1933 through roughly 1994. Under the pressure from the financial interests, the political bosses have been compelled in the last few years to make drastic economies. Tax collections have been insufficient to meet the local governmental expenses, and the unpaid public employee is not a great asset to the political machine. The banks have been unwilling to lend money unless total public expenditures are reduced. While many of the economies have not improved governmental efficiencies, and there are still many strongholds of patronage and spoils, there have been some improvements which have left the political bosses with less patronage, right? So you have the introduction of what I said before was the merit system. Of public employees. All right, so the Depression gives you for every city, basically, we're talking about Chicago, right? But for every city, there used to be 2 political machines, and now there's only 1. Kansas City, right? And now there's only 1. There's only 1 boss. Okay. And then he goes on and he uses a specific example. And look at the logic of the essay, right? Gosnell goes, and the logic of the essay is, and for your own writing, you might want to take this into account. The organization is from the general to the specific. And when you're taking notes and when you're reading these essays, you want to understand what is the author's argument, right? What is Gosnell starting off? So he starts with this premise, right? His premise is, or his question is, are machines good or bad? Are political machines good or bad? And then he says, he has this rhetorical device of the balance sheet, and he talks about a couple things that are, one could look at as being positive that the machines have done. And then now he's going on to a litany of basically the negative. And again, remember, his perspective is one of government intervention, and the New Deal is a much better way to go to help people than these ward captains and this inefficient political machine. So now he moves to even a more specific case study, and he's going to talk about the Sanitation Commission, the Chicago garbage men, basically, right? The Chicago Sanitation District. And he's saying, look at the way they hire people. Look at the way the sanitation district reformed in 1935. Again, on 170, he says, the Depression has, on the third paragraph down, the Depression has also brought greater recognition for the merit system in the municipal service. In Chicago, the civil service rules were extended to certain park districts by the new Park District Law to sanitary district legislation in 1935. To the employees of the county assessor by the new taxation legislation, and to some of the other county employees by administrative action. While the Illinois civil service legislation has been reasonably sound, the practical application of the rules has left much to be desired. The spirit of the merit system has been violated by the excessive number of temporary employees, by a vicious system of waivers, which nullifies the function of promotional examinations, by the old-fashioned practice of quote-unquote framing efficient employees, by the retention of inefficient political employees by means of legal chicanery, and from time to time by outright bribery and corruption. Leaders of both the major parties have sinned against the civil service commandments. A pre-Depression mayor of one party was frankly hostile to the merit system, and a post-Depression mayors of another party have given lip service to the system but have administrated it as politicians. If you're very interested in this topic, again, Robert Caro wrote a book on the New York, Robert Moses and the New York spoil system called The Power Broker. And it talks about how you had an employee and there was a list of the employee's job description, and if that employee was politically connected, they might be making 10, 15, 20 times of what the other person doing the same job would be making. So again, this idea of having merit, or this idea of having a universal or uniform public employee system, was accelerated during the Depression, but the machine still fought it tooth and nail. So again, he talks about the sanitation district. Now he gets even more specific, and he's talking about voters and how the machine has these techniques to not only give petty gifts or these little programs to individuals to get their loyalty, but they also make it very difficult for voters. And we, again, contemporary times, we have this constant debate between making voting more convenient, and the counter argument is making voting safe, and that people will respect it from fraud. Okay, so, and he talks about the long ballot versus the short ballot. And if you're in California and you voted, you know that we have this initiative process. And the initiative process is a process that goes back to the progressive era to make things more democratic, and it gives people the right to vote on, in our state, in California, they become constitutional amendments, and that's why the California Constitution is about 1,300 pages long. So what happens is, when you go to vote in California, right, the ballot is about that thick, because it's all the initiatives. And if you've read an initiative, you know that it doesn't simply say yes or no. The language can be so convoluted that if you vote no on something, you're really supporting it, because special interests keep on bringing these things to the voter. Now, personally, again, I'm against the initiative process because I believe we have a legislature that should vote on these things. But that's neither here nor there. The issue is that people vote and people promote and provide initiatives, and they become constitutional amendments. One of the last ones, of course, was the plastic bag in grocery stores. And don't get me started on that. And now with COVID-19, stores are handing out plastic bags, and I'm wondering to myself, isn't that against the California Constitution? But that's another issue and another lecture. So you have this long ballot, and what happens is you basically make people feel either inadequate to vote, or that old line about not being informed to vote, but you want them, again, to stay home. And Gosnell quotes again on 171, "Divide and rule is an old saying in politics. It applies with particular emphasis to American municipal politics. The old-fashioned city council elected by wards is based on the principle that if the spoils are divided into small enough units a great many individual citizens can be put under personal obligations to the machine. And again, we see this, and we see this, again, a contemporary debate on how do you elect city councils, or how do you elect local governments. And many times you'll have, especially when you're dealing with questions of racial minority representation, that you have a certain different racial or ethnic group in a concentrated area of a city. And so the people who want to control the city tend to have what they call at-large members. And then the people who challenge that, they want districts. So we've come almost full circle when it comes to this idea of how do we elect our city councils. And he goes on, and this is again related to what we're going to talk about in the next video, but he goes on and talks in terms of faith in the electoral process. Electoral corruption and petty graft weaken the faith of the masses in democratic methods, and consequently it is necessary to minimize their use if it is desired to strengthen democratic ideology. If election precincts were made larger, the total number of election officials would be reduced, and it would be harder for the political bosses to manipulate each tiny unit of the electorate. And he goes on to compare Great Britain. In some parts of the United States, fairly large precincts are used, and in a number of city ballots are being centrally counted. The control which party machines have had over election boards could be reduced by abolishing the requirements of residence within the precinct and of representation of the two dominant parties. So there was a move to make city councils nonpartisan, but people still know what candidates, parties they belong to. He goes on, if democracy is to survive in troublesome times like the present, it will have to have a firmer foundation than the cohesive power of public plunder. Too often, the methods employed by party machines to finance their various activities have given rise to the charge that our democracy is a demagogic plutocracy. As long as the parties rely on contributions from businessmen who are seeking special favors, criminal elements which are seeking protection against interference on the part of the law enforcement authorities, and office holders who regard their loyalty to the party above that to the state, cynicism regarding the electoral process will be widespread. The power of money in American municipal politics could be regulated to much greater extent than it is at the present. These are still problems today, especially on lower level local governmental boards like community college boards or water boards or these other things that we have in the state. And so you have, I know in a case in San Bernardino County, you had county supervisors spending almost $1 million to get elected to a county position that pays nothing, and that is not very well known. Why? Well, these architects and construction businesses put these people on these boards so that the counties could have bonds and so that they could build buildings. And so this is what happens. Pardon me. It's just not political machines, but it's these local governmental bodies that have bond issuing power that businesses want to control. On page 173, as I said earlier, he talks about the cutting off of immigration, but that's not really, again, that's a very superficial analysis on his part, or it's time related. So he finishes, if the struggle against the party machine is to be successful, more democratic methods for financing political campaigns must be devised. Local parties dedicated to the ideal of voluntary precinct work must be organized, and the citizens must be educated to demand services of the government rather than special favors from politicians. Right? So again, how does he look at, what does he look at when he's talking about reforming? He says, A, you reform the money. B, the local party has to reform using voluntary ward captains. And the third, educating the people. Those are all three things that sound nice, but really have not been invoked. Especially, again, if you want to go back to, if you're curious, to the Schlesinger book I mentioned, this idea of what happens in the schools shapes how we view each other as Americans is a very important point that has been ignored by many politicians and many curriculum writers for the last 40 years. So that is Gosnell's essay number 32 on the machine politics. And we're talking about this because, again, it was the machine, but the product of the machine was the party. So the political party is important and was important during that time because it wasn't the person that ran for office, it was the party. And so a vast majority of people were voting for the party, and the party had that party identification. That's much different than today. Today, political parties' primary function is to, offer a place on the ballot, almost a fill in the blank, for individual candidates, for politicians, because today we vote for the person, not the party. And that's a big difference than it was in the 1930s and 1920s. Next time, we're going to be talking about what is responsible government vis-a-vis political parties, and I'll be talking about essays number 33 and number 34. I'll see you until then. I'll see you. Have a good evening.